Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain about interrupt. So in computer architecture, an interrupt is a signal to the processor emitted by hardware or software indicating an event that needs immediate attention. So we can say that whenever program is executed, at that time some signal is received and that signal needs an immediate attention or that signal needs an immediate execution. So at that time we need to stop our currently running program and we are executing that received signal, and then we'll start executing our old program. So that signal is called the interrupt. So our processor repeatedly keeps on checking for synchronization in and synchronization out bits for the synchronization in the program. So hence the processor does not do anything useful other than running the infinite loops. So the work of the processor is only to execute the instructions. So it may possible that it may go into the infinite loop, and every time the processor checks the in and out bits for execution of the program. So to avoid this situation, input-output device can have the concept of interrupts. So when the input-output device is ready, it could signal the processor on the separate line called the interrupt request line. So we can say that when any hardware device or any software signal needs to be executed in between the currently running program, at that time that interrupt signal is generated and that request for executing that signal passes through the interrupt request line. On receiving the interrupt, the processor reads the input-output devices and hence removing the infinite loop waiting mechanism. So when our processor receives that interrupt signal, at that time the processor reads any input or the output from that device, and before that the processor is in the infinite loop of the waiting. But when it receives some types of interrupt signals at that time, and the processor removes that infinite loop of the waiting mechanism. So for example, let us take a task that involves two activities. First is perform some computation and then print the result. Whatever we are computing, and at the end we need to print the result. So here one task for the computation and the second task is for the printout. So we can say that the compute routine passes through n lines and print the output. So the print routine then sends one line to the printer, and instead of printing that line, it executes itself and passes the control to the compute routine. And the compute routine continues its activity. Once the line has been printed, the printer sends an interrupt to the processor of the computer. At this point, the compute routine is suspended and the print routine is activated, and the print routine sends a second line to the printer so that the printer can keep on printing the lines and processor continues. So this is how the interrupt actually works. Now, although interrupts have a highest priority than other signals, and there are many types of interrupts, but basic types of the interrupts are mainly hardware interrupts and the software interrupts. Here we can say that because when we receive the interrupt signal, at that time we are stopping our continuous running program, and then we'll execute the interrupt signal. So that is why we can say that the priority of the interrupt signal is very high. So let's start with the first, which is a hardware interrupts. So if the signal for the processor is from external device or hardware device, then it is called the hardware interrupts. So what it means? So let's understand the hardware interrupts with example. So suppose from keyboard we'll press the key to do some action. This pressing of key in keyboard will generate a signal which is given to the processor to do action, and such interrupts are called the hardware interrupts. Hardware interrupts can be classified into two categories, which is a maskable interrupt and non-maskable interrupts. The first is a maskable. So the hardware interrupts which can be delayed when a much highest priority interrupt has occurred to the processor. So when the interrupt signal is received, at that time the hardware interrupts may be stopped, and that highest priority interrupt will be executed, and then this lower priority hardware interrupts will be executed. So that is the maskable interrupts. Next is a non-maskable interrupt. It means the hardware which cannot be delayed and should process by the processor immediately. Here in the non-maskable interrupt, it is not waiting for any other interrupts, or this signal cannot be delayed. It will execute it immediately. Second type of the interrupt is the software interrupts. So software interrupt is also divided into the two parts, which is a normal interrupts and the exceptions. So the normal interrupts or the software interrupts is the interrupts which are caused by the software instructions are called the software interrupts. So the interrupts that is generated due to some software instructions. So when some instruction is executed, at that time the software requires some input, and due to that software instruction the interrupt is generated, and that is called the normal interrupts. Second is the exception. So the unplanned interrupts while executing program is called the exception. So the example of the exception is while executing a program, if we got a value which should be divided by 0, so that is called the exception. So these are the main two types of interrupts. Now why the need for the interrupts? So the operating system is a reactive program. So when you give some input, it will perform computations and produce output, but meanwhile you can interact with the system by interrupting the running processes, or you can stop and start another processes. So when one process is executed, at that time suppose we want to execute some another process, so if interrupt is not there, at that time we cannot do this, but with the help of interrupts we can simultaneously executing the multiple processes. So this reactiveness is due to the interrupt, and all modern operating systems are the interrupt driven. So that is the brief introduction of interrupts. So that's it. Thank you so much.